It started with the smell of smoke. Not the good kind, the kind that rises from a chimney on a cold morning. This was the other kind, the kind that smells like ruin. Ezekiel Boone, a man the folks in Dust Whistle just called Zeke, was riding back from town. His old mare Sabbath was steady under him, the saddlebags full of seed and oats. It was supposed to be a normal day, but the air was wrong. He kicked Sabbath into a desperate gallop, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that was pure dread. The farm came into view and his blood ran cold. The smoke wasn't from a brush fire. It was pouring from the shattered windows of his own home. His home. He practically fell off the horse before it even stopped, his boots hitting the dirt hard. The front door was hanging off its hinges, splintered and black, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The world went silent. The wind stopped. The birds stopped. Even his own breathing seemed to stop. He stepped over the threshold into the gloom, and the first thing he smelled wasn't smoke. It was blood. She was lying near the kitchen table. His Ruth. Her apron, the one she always wore, was torn. Her hand was clenched around a carving fork, a makeshift weapon she'd used to defend her home, to defend their son. There was no peace in her eyes, only the shock of a final, brutal fight. Zeke felt his chest tighten, a knot of something so cold and heavy he thought it might just pull him down through the floorboards. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He just stood there, a statue carved from grief. Then he saw him, Micah, his boy, 16 years old, all lanky arms and quick smiles. He was by the stairs, a broken rifle next to his hand. He looked like he'd just fallen asleep in the middle of telling a joke. Peaceful, too peaceful. Zeke didn't cry. He didn't scream. Men like him didn't have that luxury. The grief was a private thing, an animal that lived inside your ribs, and you didn't dare let it out. He knelt by his son, his hand trembling as he brushed the hair from the boy's forehead. He whispered a name, a promise, something meant only for the two of them. Then he moved to Ruth. He gently closed her eyes, his calloused thumb brushing against her cold skin. He buried them that night, under the big cottonwood tree out back. He dug the graves himself, the shovel moving with a grim, steady rhythm. The sky was starless and black, offering no comfort, no witness. It was just him, the two bodies, and a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. At dawn, he placed two simple wooden markers in the soft earth. One read, Ruth. The other, Micah. He left a small, hand-carved wooden horse by his son's grave. For Ruth, he left one of her white embroidery cloths. Then he walked back into the hollowed-out, blackened shell of his house, the place where his life used to be. He didn't go to the kitchen. He didn't go to the bedroom. He went straight to the cellar. He pried a loose board from the floor, his fingers knowing exactly where to go. And underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a box. It was old, sealed with rust, and a promise he had made to himself years ago. A promise to never open it again. But promises are for men who have something left to lose. He carried it upstairs and set it on the one table that wasn't broken. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a silver pistol. It gleamed in the dim light, hungry and cold. Next to it was a worn leather holster and a Bible. But this was no ordinary Bible. Its pages were filled with notes, names, and coded verses, and on the inside cover, written in a hand he hadn't used in a decade, was a name. Not Ezekiel Boone, the farmer. It read, Ezekiel, the preacher. He stared at the name, at the pistol, at the man he used to be. A man who didn't plant seeds but buried sinners. A man who spoke in scripture and settled debts with lead. He picked up the pistol. It felt familiar, like coming home to a house you should have burned down long ago. He began to clean it, his movements slow, methodical, and perfect. The rage inside him was finally cooling, hardening into something else, something sharper, something colder. Far away, on a high ridge overlooking the valley, 3 riders watched the smoke rise from the farm. One of them, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, lowered a spyglass. He's still alive, he grunted, spitting into the dust. Another one laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Just some old farmer. He ain't gonna do nothing. The first man shook his head, his eyes narrow. You didn't see the look on his face in town? That ain't no farmer. That's a ghost waiting for a reason to start haunting. Back in the farmhouse, Zeke didn't know he was being watched. He didn't care. He held the polished silver pistol up to the light, the metal cold against his skin. He whispered to it, a prayer to an old and terrible god. You remember how to sing? Then he blew out the candle, and the world went dark. The next morning, Dust Whistle woke to a sky the color of old bruises, a gray, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the town, choking the morning birds into silence. And then they saw him. Ezekiel Boone rode in on his old mare, Sabbath. But this wasn't the quiet farmer they knew. This was a different man. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes holding a cold fire that made folks step back. He wore a long dark coat, and underneath it you could see the shape of a pistol holstered high on his hip. He wasn't just a grieving man, he was a reckoning. The town went quiet as he passed. Voices dropped to whispers. A kid playing on a barrel froze, his mouth hanging open, watching as if a character from a penny dreadful had just ridden into his life. The bell on the door of Harper's supply store jingled, a nervous, tinny sound. Old man Harper looked up from his ledger, and his friendly smile died on his lips. His eyes locked on the gun at Zeke's hip. Zeke, he stammered, didn't expect you back so soon. Zeke didn't say a word. He just slapped a small, folded piece of paper onto the counter. It wasn't a list. It was a declaration of war. Rope, lantern oil, ammunition. Harper read the list, and the color drained from his face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. Zeke, you sure this is the road you want to be on? Zeke's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. This ain't a road, he said. It's a return. Harper's eyes widened. He suddenly remembered the old whispers, the stories told around campfires about a man they called the preacher. A man who carried a silver pistol and a marked-up Bible, who left a trail of bodies from El Paso to the Dakota territories. That was you, wasn't it? Harper whispered, his voice trembling. The preacher. Zeke just stared at him. The silence was all the answer Harper needed. He turned, his hands shaking, and began to gather the supplies. This wasn't a sale. It was an offering to a man who had become something more than human, something to be feared. Zeke left the store and led his horse not towards the trail out of town, but toward the old abandoned church at the edge of the street. Its paint was peeled, its bell silent for years. It looked like a skeleton reaching for a god that had long since left. He pushed open the creaking doors and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. He sat in the very back pew, the silence of the place as thick and heavy as a shroud. He pulled out the old Bible, its leather cover worn soft as skin. He opened it to a blank page. His hand, steady as a rock, wrote two names in the empty space: Ruth Boone, Micah Boone, and beneath them, a single verse from the Psalms. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow. He stopped. He didn't finish the line. He didn't need to. He was no longer walking through the valley. He was the valley. A soft sound made him look up. A woman stood in the doorway, a basket on her hip. June Carver, a widow herself, her husband Thomas lost to a blizzard 4 winters back. Her face was pale, her eyes full of a sad, quiet understanding. They say you buried them yourself, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I did. They say you haven't shed a tear. Zeke closed the Bible. They ain't looking close enough. She took a few steps closer, her boots clicking softly on the dusty floorboards. Zeke, I know what it means to grieve quiet, but what you're planning, vengeance is a fire that burns the man holding the match just as much as it burns his enemies. He turned just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes were voids. I ain't trying to come back, June. The words hung in the air between them, cold and final. She didn't argue. She just reached into her basket and pulled out a pair of worn leather gloves. She walked forward and placed them on the pew next to him. You'll need your hands warm, she said softly. Cold fingers shoot crooked. He stared at the gloves, a flicker of something, gratitude, surprise, in his eyes, but he said nothing. She turned and left. the church door groaning shut behind her, leaving him alone with his ghosts and his guns. He was just about to leave when another shadow fell across the doorway. Sheriff Arden Crow. He was young, with the kind of jaw that suggested he was too stubborn for his own good. He wore his tin star like it was armor. "Zeke," he said, his voice hard, "I'm hearing things. Things about you carrying iron again. Things about you going after those men yourself." Zeke didn't even look at him. "Let him talk." Crow stepped closer, his hand resting near the butt of his own pistol. "This is my town, my law. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. That's not justice. That's murder." Zeke finally turned to face him, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical blow. "They burned my wife alive," he said, his voice a low growl. "They shot my boy down like a dog. They did it in your town. So you tell me, Sheriff, where was your law then?" Crow had no answer. Zeke mounted Sabbath, the leather of the saddle creaking like a coffin lid. He looked down at the young sheriff, a man clinging to rules in a world that had none. "Vengeance doesn't plant crops, Zeke," Crow said, one last desperate plea. "It just burns the whole field down." Zeke stared out at the western ridges, toward the canyons that folded into the earth like scars. "Then maybe," he whispered, "it's time this whole damn world burned." He rode out of town without a backward glance, a lone, dark figure against a dying sun. He was no longer Ezekiel Boone, the farmer. He was the preacher, and the sermon was about to begin. The wilderness didn't welcome him. It tested him. The canyons were a maze of ash-colored rock and brittle skeletal pines. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the wind whispered the names of the dead. Zeke didn't notice. He was a predator on the hunt, and the world had narrowed to a single purpose: the trail. On the second day he found it, the remains of a small campfire, and in the soft dirt, a boot print. The heel was worn down on the left side, a detail so small most men would miss it. But Zeke wasn't most men. He remembered seeing a man with a slight limp back at Harper's store, one of the strangers who had sneered at him. 3 men, 1 limps. He was getting closer. He moved without a sound, a phantom gliding through the trees. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He was running on something more potent than food or rest. He was running on pure, uncut hatred. That night, he made a cold camp under a rock overhang. He didn't risk a fire. Instead, he pulled out his journal, the Bible, and a piece of charcoal. He drew symbols on a blank page, a cryptic map of vengeance only he could read. Names, locations, sins, a ledger of death. He paused, his charcoal hovering over the page. He added a single chilling line that hadn't been written in over a decade. The sermon begins at dusk. The next day he saw the smoke, a thin, lazy curl rising from a hollow a few miles ahead. He left Sabbath tied in a hidden ravine and moved forward on foot, silent as a shadow. He crept to the edge of a ridge and looked down. There they were, 3 men laughing around a fire. One of them, a big man with a greasy beard, was polishing his revolver. Zeke recognized him instantly. He was the one who had called him an old man back in town. "Ain't nobody coming for us," the big man boasted, his voice carrying on the still air. "That old farmer's probably halfway to drunk by now, crying into his beer." Another man, thin and twitchy, shivered despite the heat. "I don't know, Emmett. That house, it burned fast. And that woman? Never heard a scream like that before." The big man, Emmett, just chuckled. "That's 'cause you ain't been around much." Zeke's hand went to the silver pistol at his hip. His finger slid over the trigger. He could end it right here. 1, 2, 3 shots, 3 bodies, a tidy end to a messy story. But his hand dropped. He retreated back into the cover of the trees, his breath coming in shallow bursts. No, not like this. An easy death was a mercy, and these men didn't deserve mercy. They deserved fear. They deserved to know who was hunting them. They deserved to understand the hell they had unleashed. This wasn't just about killing them. It was about dismantling them, piece by agonizing piece. He had a new plan, a darker plan. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound behind him. A twig snap. Instinct took over. He spun around, the silver pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. Standing there, frozen in terror, was a boy. No older than Micah had been. His face was smeared with dirt, his eyes wide with fear. He was one of them, the one who had held the horses. Please, the boy whimpered, his hands shooting up in surrender. I, I didn't know. I swear. They said it was just a robbery. I didn't know they were gonna kill anyone. Zeke stared at the boy. He saw Micah's face. He saw the innocence that had been stolen from his own life. The pistol in his hand felt impossibly heavy. It shook just once. A war raged inside him. The farmer versus the preacher. Vengeance versus something else. Something he thought was long dead. He lowered the pistol. Run, he growled, his voice thick with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. Run and don't ever look back. The boy didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled away, disappearing into the trees like a frightened deer. What would you have done? Would you have shown mercy? Let me know in the comments below. Zeke watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He had just made a decision that might get him killed. He had let a witness go. But it was more than that. He had just spared a life. And in doing so, he had complicated everything. He turned back to the ridge. The fire below crackled, the laughter of the two remaining men echoing in the twilight. Emmett Rayner raised a whiskey bottle to the sky in a mock toast. Zeke watched them, his face unreadable. He had let the boy go. But for these two, for them, the sermon was just getting started, and it was going to be a long, painful one. Night fell on the ridges like a judgment. The moon hid its face behind a thick veil of clouds, plunging the canyons into an oppressive, inky blackness. Zeke didn't need light. He had the darkness inside him. He sat on the ridge, a patient predator, watching the two outlaws drink themselves into a stupor. Their laughter had faded, replaced by the slurred, ugly cadence of men trying to forget what they'd done. Emmett Rayner, the leader, was telling a crude story, his words stumbling over each other. The other man, a tall, lanky outlaw with a nasty scar down his face, just grunted in response. Zeke reached into his coat and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden cross. It was no bigger than his thumb, a relic from another life, from a time when he believed in things like salvation. He pressed it into the dirt beside him, a silent, grim prayer. The sermon begins with silence. He moved just before dawn, when the air was at its coldest and sleep was at its deepest. The campfire was nothing but a pile of glowing embers. The two men were sprawled on the ground, snoring loudly. He was a ghost. His boots made no sound on the pine needles. He circled the camp, his eyes scanning for tripwires, for any sign of a watch. There was none. They were arrogant. They believed they were the hunters, not the hunted. They were wrong. The tall one, the man with the scar, was the first to stir. He grumbled, sat up, and stumbled toward the edge of the clearing to relieve himself. Zeke waited. The man finished, zipped his trousers, and turned around, and found himself staring down the barrel of a silver pistol. Zeke didn't speak. He just gestured with the gun. Walk. The man's eyes went wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful. The whiskey-fueled bravado evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling animal. He opened his mouth to shout, but Zeke was faster. My boy was 16, Zeke whispered, his voice colder than the grave. He didn't get to make a sound. Neither will you. He led the man into a narrow ravine, far from the camp. He bound his hands and feet with rope, stuffed a gag in his mouth, and left him tied to a tree, his eyes screaming the things his mouth could not. One down. He slipped back to the camp. The leader, Emmett, was still dead to the world, snoring with his mouth wide open. It would have been so easy. A single bullet. But that wasn't the plan. He moved around the sleeping form and found what he was looking for. Their horses. He took out his knife. He didn't harm the animals. Instead, he carefully cut the straps on their saddles, weakening them just enough so they would snap under pressure. He did the same to the strap holding Emmett's own rifle. Then he went back to his hiding place and waited. The sun started to climb and Emmett finally woke up. He sat up groaning and rubbed his face. He looked around. Leech, he called out, his voice hoarse. Where you at? Silence. Emmett stood up, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He saw Leach's bedroll, but the man was gone. He saw the cold coffee pot, knocked over on its side. He saw the disturbed dirt. He wasn't stupid. He'd been in this life long enough to know the smell of trouble. He reached for his pistol. "I know you're out there," he yelled, his voice echoing through the silent canyon. "Come on! You want a piece of me? Come and get it!" Zeke remained hidden, a statue in the trees. Emmett spun around, his eyes wild, scanning the shadows. He was a cornered animal now, all bluster and fear. "I heard the stories, you know, about the preacher, a boogeyman who quotes the Bible before he kills you. Just a campfire story, I thought." Still no movement. Emmett's hand tightened on his gun. He was starting to sweat. The silence was getting to him, chewing at the edges of his sanity. Then a shadow shifted to his left, a bird taking flight. But Emmett's frayed nerves couldn't tell the difference. He whipped around and fired. Bang! Bang! 2 shots, echoing like thunder, hitting nothing but rock and tree bark. "You missed!" The voice came from right behind him. Emmett froze. He turned around slowly. Zeke was standing there, not 10 feet away. His own pistol was drawn, but it wasn't aimed. He was just standing there, a specter of vengeance in the morning light. Emmett's face twisted into a snarl. "Should have known you'd come in quiet." Zeke took a slow step forward and another. He closed the distance between them until they were close enough to touch. Close enough for Emmett to see the utter absence of mercy in his eyes. "They screamed, you know," Emmett taunted, his voice a low, vicious rasp. "Your wife and your boy. The boy. He called out for you. But you weren't there, were you, farmer? You were off buying oats while your family was dying." Something broke inside Zeke, a dam of controlled rage that had been holding for days. He didn't say a word. He just lunged. The fight was brutal and ugly. It wasn't a duel. It was a brawl. Emmett was bigger, stronger, but Zeke was faster, fueled by a grief so profound it had become a weapon. Emmett knocked the pistol from Zeke's hand, sending it skittering into the sagebrush. Zeke drove his knee into Emmett's gut, followed by a fist that cracked against the outlaw's jaw. They went down, rolling in the dirt, choking on dust and spitting curses. Emmett was a brawler. He got on top, his thick fingers wrapping around Zeke's throat, squeezing the life out of him. Zeke's vision started to go dark at the edges. But the preacher was more than just a brawler. He was a survivor. His hand shot down to his boot, and when it came back up, it was holding a knife. He slammed the butt of the knife in Emmett's temple. The big man grunted, his grip loosening just enough. Zeke twisted, reversing their positions, and pressed the cold steel of the blade against Emmett's throat. Emmett laughed, a strangled, bloody sound. "Go on then, preacher. Do it. Say a verse for me first. Ain't that your style?" Zeke's hand trembled. He could feel the man's pulse beating against the blade. He could end it all right now. But the image of his son's peaceful face flashed in his mind, the memory of Ruth's hand on his back. He pulled the knife away. He stood up, his chest heaving, and walked over to the sagebrush. He found his silver pistol, wiped the dust from the barrel, and holstered it. Emmett was still on the ground, staring up at him, a mixture of disbelief and fury in his eyes. "What are you waiting for? You gonna kill me or not?" Zeke looked down at the man who had destroyed his world. "Not here," he said, his voice flat and empty. "Death is too quick. You don't deserve quick." He bound Emmett just like he had the other one. Then he dragged him, kicking and cursing, over to the ravine. He tied him to the tree right next to his friend. Now they were both his prisoners, helpless, powerless. Zeke sat across from them, just out of reach, and started sharpening his knife on a stone. The slow, rhythmic shk, shk, shk of steel on stone was the only sound in the canyon. It was the sound of a promise, the promise of a slow, painful reckoning. He had them, both of them. But now he had a problem, a big one. What was he going to do with them? He could kill them, but that felt too easy. He could take them back to Dust Whistle. But could he trust the law? Could he trust Sheriff Crow to deliver real justice? As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the canyon, he heard the sound of a horse approaching, a single rider. Sheriff Crow appeared at the edge of the ravine, his rifle held ready. He took in the scene, The two outlaws bound and gagged, and Zeke sitting like a stone judge, sharpening his blade. "Zeke," Crow said, his voice strained. "It's over. You found them." Zeke didn't even look up from his knife. "They're bound, haven't fed 'em. Ain't decided what to do with 'em yet." The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked exhausted but determined. "You know what the law says, Zeke? They get a trial." "I know what the law says," Zeke replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "I also know what it does. It fails. It's slow. And it lets men like this walk free." Crow took a deep breath. "You were right about the town, Zeke. About justice not coming fast enough. But if you do this your way, if you become a killer, they'll bury you right next to the ones you lost. You'll be no better than them." Zeke finally looked up, and the look in his eyes made the young sheriff take an involuntary step back. "Better?" Zeke whispered. "I stopped trying to be better the day I buried my son." He stood up and walked over to his prisoners. He looked down at Emmett, whose eyes still burned with defiance. "Then why didn't you kill them already?" Crow asked, his voice pleading. "What are you waiting for?" Zeke stared into the deepening darkness of the canyon. "I wanted them to know fear," he said. "Not the quick fear of a bullet, the slow kind, the kind that sits with you in the dark, the kind that makes you understand the true value of a single breath." He turned back to Crow. "And now?" Crow asked. Zeke's face was grim. "Now, I want the town to see them hang. I want the widows to spit at their boots. I want every outlaw from here to the border to know that this is what happens when you spill innocent blood in Dust Whistle." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Zeke, then at the two pathetic figures tied to the tree. He made a decision. "All right, Zeke," he said, his voice firm. "Then we do it my way, but we do it together. Ride with me. We'll bring them back in chains. We'll let the people see justice served. The right way." Zeke hesitated. He looked at his knife. He looked at Emmett's throat. It would be so easy to end it, to satisfy the howling animal inside him. But then he looked east, toward the horizon, where the sun would rise, where his farm was, where his family was buried. "All right, Sheriff," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his choice. "Let's bring 'em home." The ride back to Dust Whistle was a funeral procession. Zeke and Sheriff Crow rode side by side, the two bound outlaws trudging behind them, ropes tied to Zeke's saddle horn. The sun beat down on them, a merciless, silent witness. No one spoke. The only sounds were the plodding of the horses and the ragged breathing of the prisoners. Crow kept glancing at Zeke, trying to read the man's face. He was looking for some sign of regret, or relief, or maybe even a flicker of the farmer he used to know. He found nothing. Zeke's face was a granite mask, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and hadn't bothered to wipe the soot from his soul. As they neared the town, they saw a figure waiting for them on the road. It was June Carver. She stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face etched with worry. As they drew closer, she didn't look at the prisoners. She didn't look at the sheriff. Her eyes were only for Zeke. "You're alive," she said, her voice filled with a profound, quiet relief. Zeke just nodded, his expression unchanging. But then, something strange happened. As they passed her, one of the prisoners, the tall one named Leach, stumbled. He looked at June, and a flicker of recognition, of pure, gut-wrenching terror, flashed in his eyes. He started mumbling something through his gag, his words muffled but frantic. Zeke saw it. He reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing. He dismounted and walked over to Leach. He ripped the gag from the man's mouth. "What did you say?" Zeke demanded. Leach was trembling, his eyes darting from Zeke to June, and back again. "Her?" he stammered, spitting out dirt and fear. "It's her. We weren't just supposed to hit your farm, preacher. We had another target." A cold dread, heavier than any grief he'd yet felt, settled over Zeke. "What other target?" Leach looked at June again, his face a mask of primal fear. "Her husband," he choked out. "Thomas Carver. He wasn't lost in no blizzard. Emmett killed him. Years ago. We were sent to your farm to get something you had, and we were supposed to shut her up for good, for what she might know." The world tilted on its axis. June let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Sheriff Crow stared, his face pale with shock. Zeke turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Emmett. The leader was smirking, a smug, evil little smile on his bloody lips. "Surprise, preacher," Emmett sneered. "Turns out your little farm town ain't so innocent after all. We ain't just random thieves. We're messengers." Zeke's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't just about his family. This was something bigger, something older and uglier. "Who sent you?" Zeke's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the deadly promise of a rattlesnake's hiss. Emmett's smirk widened. "A man you know very well, preacher. A man you used to work for. A man who wants his ledger back." The ledger? The Bible. His journal filled with names and sins. "He heard you'd settled down, gone soft," Emmett continued, enjoying every second of Zeke's torment. "He sent us to get his book and to clean up loose ends. Your family, they were just a bonus, a way to send you a message. And the widow Carver? She was next on the list." Zeke felt the ground give way beneath him. He had been so focused on his own pain, his own vengeance, that he had missed the real story. He wasn't the hunter, he was the hunted, and his quest for revenge had nearly led another innocent person to their death. He looked at June. Her face was ashen, her eyes filled with a dawning horror, and a grief 4 years old, suddenly fresh and raw again. He had brought this darkness to her doorstep. His past, the one he had tried to bury, had come back to claim more victims. He turned back to Emmett, and the cold control he had maintained for days finally, completely shattered. The farmer was gone. The preacher was gone. All that was left was an abyss of pure, undiluted rage. He drew the silver pistol from its holster. The click of the hammer being pulled back was deafening in the sudden silence. "Zeke, no!" Sheriff Crow yelled, reaching for his own weapon. "Don't do it! Not like this!" But Zeke wasn't listening. He aimed the pistol right between Emmett's smug, smiling eyes. This was it, the moment of truth. Justice or vengeance, the law or the bullet. He had to make a choice, and the entire soul of Dust Whistle was hanging in the balance. The hammer was cocked. The barrel was steady. Zeke's finger tightened on the trigger. Emmett Rayner just laughed, a broken, gurgling sound. "Do it, preacher. Show 'em all who you really are. You ain't a farmer. You're a killer, just like me." Time seemed to slow down. Zeke could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum against his ribs. He could see the dust motes dancing in the air. He could see the terror in Sheriff Crow's eyes, the silent plea in June's. And he could see Micah's face, not peaceful in death, but smiling in life, telling him a joke in the hen house. He could hear Ruth's voice humming a soft tune as she baked bread. They were better than him, and they had wanted him to be better too. With a roar that was part grief, part fury, part surrender, Zeke did something no one expected. He didn't shoot. He swung the heavy pistol like a club, smashing the butt of it into the side of Emmett's head. The outlaw's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the ground unconscious. Silence. Zeke stood over the body, his chest heaving, the pistol hanging limply in his hand. He looked up, his eyes finding June's. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words seemed to tear something raw from his throat. Sheriff Crow slowly lowered his own gun, his face a mixture of relief and awe. He had just witnessed a man win the war against his own demons. They rode into Dust Whistle not as a lawman and a vigilante, but as partners. The townspeople poured out of the saloon and the supply store, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. They saw the two bound outlaws, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. But then they saw the look on Zeke's face, the exhaustion, the grief, and the hard-won restraint. They dragged Emmett and Leach to the center of town and tied them to the support posts of the water tower. Sheriff Crow turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "These men are responsible for the deaths of Ruth and Micah Boone," he announced them, "but that's not all. They were sent here, sent to cover up another murder, the murder of Thomas Carver." A collective gasp went through the crowd. June Carver stepped forward, her body trembling, but her voice clear. "My Thomas, He didn't die in a storm, she said, her words cutting through the stunned silence. He was murdered. By him. She pointed a shaking finger at the unconscious form of Emmett Rayner. The town was in an uproar. This wasn't just an attack on a lone farm anymore. This was an attack on all of them. The evil they thought was far away, out in the territories, was right here, in their own quiet town. But then, a voice from the back of the crowd yelled out, "How do we know this is true? How do we know it ain't just the word of a killer?" All eyes turned to Zeke. He was the preacher, a man with a past as dark as any outlaw's. Old man Harper, the store owner, stepped forward, his face pale and sweaty. "The sheriff's right to be cautious. This man, this preacher, he's got a history. Maybe he brought this trouble on us himself." Zeke looked at Harper, and he saw it, a flicker of fear in the old man's eyes. A specific kind of fear, the fear of being found out. Zeke remembered something. When he'd come to town for supplies, Harper had seemed nervous. He'd asked too many questions. And the outlaws, they had appeared in the store just moments after Zeke had left. It wasn't a coincidence. "It was you," Zeke said, his voice low and dangerous. "You told them where my farm was. You told them when I'd be in town." Harper sputtered, his face turning red. That's a lie. A desperate accusation from a murderer." "Is it?" Zeke said, taking a slow step toward him. "Let me ask you something, Harper. How's your sister doing? The one back in El Paso? The one who married that real estate man? What was his name again?" "Oh, that's right. Marcus Thorne." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne was a name whispered in fear all across the territory. A ruthless land baron who bought up farms and ranches, using intimidation and violence to get what he wanted. A man known for hiring men like Emmett Rayner. A man whose name was written several times in Zeke's old ledger. Harper's face went white as a sheet. He was connected. He was the traitor. "Thorne sent them, didn't he?" Zeke pressed, his voice like iron. "He wanted my ledger, the one that proves all his crimes, the one that could bring his whole empire down. And you helped him. You sold us out, Harper. You sold out Ruth and Micah for a piece of silver." Harper tried to run, but the townsfolk who just moments before had been whispering about Zeke now turned on him. They surrounded the old storekeeper, their faces hard with betrayal. Sheriff Crow clapped the irons on Harper's wrists. "It's over," he said. Justice was finally being served, not by a bullet in a dark canyon, but here, in the light of day, for all to see. The trial was swift. Emmett and Leach, faced with the testimony of the entire town, confessed everything. They, along with Harper, were sentenced to hang. The threat of Marcus Thorne still loomed in the distance. But for the first time in a long time, the people of Dust Whistle felt safe. They had faced the darkness and won. In the days that followed, something in the town shifted. They looked at Zeke differently. He wasn't the strange, silent farmer anymore. And he wasn't the terrifying preacher. He was just Zeke. Their Zeke, a man who had lost everything, but had still chosen to protect them. One evening, as the sun was setting, Zeke stood by the graves of his wife and son. The wooden markers were stark against the golden light. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see June Carver. She didn't say anything. She just stood with him, sharing the silence. After a long while, she reached out and placed something in his hand. It was a small, worn Bible, her husband Thomas's Bible. "He would have wanted you to have it," she said softly. Zeke opened it. On the inside cover, in neat handwriting, was a single pressed flower. A violet from Ruth's old garden. A gift from one widow to another, passed on to him. A symbol of a grief shared, and a future that might still hold some small measure of peace. He looked at June, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and for the first time since he'd smelled the smoke, he felt a flicker of something other than pain. It might have been hope. He hadn't saved his own family. He would carry that failure for the rest of his days. But he had saved the town. He had saved June. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he had saved a small piece of himself. He closed the Bible, the pressed flower safe inside. The preacher was dead and buried, but Ezekiel Boone, the farmer, the man who planted things, was still here, and he had a whole new field to sow. Seasons turned. The raw wound on the town of Dust Whistle began to scar over, and the scars began to fade. The gallows where Emmett Raynor and his conspirators met their end was taken down, its wood used to rebuild the church bell tower. Zeke never touched his silver pistol again. He wrapped it in the old oilcloth, along with the preacher's ledger, and buried it deep in the earth, under the roots of a new cottonwood tree he planted next to the graves of his family. He and June never spoke of marriage, or love, or any of the words that felt too big for the quiet space they were building between them. Instead, they spoke in shared chores and comfortable silences. She would bring him fresh bread. He would leave a basket of vegetables on her porch. They would sit together on his rebuilt porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, the colors of a healing bruise. The town changed too. Sheriff Crow became a man respected not just for his star, but for the wisdom in his eyes. The people of Dust Whistle, bound by the tragedy they had endured, became more than just neighbors. They became a family. One day a young boy, the son of the blacksmith, came up to Zeke while he was tending his corn. "Mr. Boone?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with the hero worship of the young. "Is it true? Were you really the preacher?" Zeke stopped his work. He knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. He looked at the rich soil on his hands, at the green stalks rising toward the sun. "The preacher was a man who spent his life taking things from the earth," he said, his voice quiet and gentle. "I'm just a farmer. I prefer putting things back in." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and ran off to chase a grasshopper. Zeke stood up and looked out over his fields. The land was quiet, peaceful. He could hear the sound of June's humming as she walked up the path from town. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his face. The ghosts of his past were still there. They always would be, but now they were quiet. They walked beside him, not behind him. They were memories, not chains. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and he had come out the other side. Not unscathed, not unbroken, but alive. And with the courage to plant something new, right where the pain first took root. And sometimes, that's the only kind of salvation a man can ask for. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dive into the dark and dusty corners of the past. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Zeke made the right choice in the end? Until next time, stay safe out there.